to, yeah, I guess we are live. So that's awesome. Checking. I have chat on my side, by the way, so you won't be able to see chat. But I will try to, as I'm coding, I will try to monitor the chat and stuff as well. So it'll
Multi-threading.
be a little bit, yeah, it'll be a little interesting. I'm probably going to be coding stuff and someone will say like, hey, Nick, that's totally wrong. And it's going to be like, oh no. But
Relax.
exactly. We'll take a deep breath and we'll get through it. So I wanted to say, first of all, thanks for joining me. You had reached out to me about going through a refactoring exercise, and I thought that this would be a cool opportunity to just try and do it live, because what better way to refactor stuff than to see it kind of break and fall apart and try to put it back together. So
Yeah,
thank you for reaching out.
thank you.
I want to just double check. Okay, it looks like people are able to connect. I wanted to make sure that it's not just broken off this platform. So we are on Riverside here. I'm going to be streaming my desktop in a second. But for context, what we're going to be going through today is a live refactoring exercise. So fingers crossed that this goes pretty smooth. It's going to be in C Sharp. And Rosario, you had mentioned, so you got my course on refactoring, and there's still some things like you kind of want to navigate and see if we can have some other patterns for stuff and kind of just
Yeah, yeah,
improve overall refactoring skills. Is that fair to say?
yeah. I'm pretty sure there are tons of things I still need to navigate and improve on. But I think one of the best ways, as you said, it's live streaming, or just people with other developers, because we can share our knowledge and we can learn new things every day. That's the main thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So for folks that are watching this live, if you if you have questions and comments, put them in the chat as we're going. I'm guaranteed to mess things up as I'm going through this. It's only reality, so that's fine. And if you're watching the recorded version, hopefully you find this useful. And if you want to see more stuff like this, obviously just comment, send me a message, let me know, and we can go through more stuff like this. So again, thank you for getting this set up. I want to be able to kind of chat through before going into code, like what refactoring is, because I think there's a definition of refactoring that if you were to go look it up on the internet or find it in a textbook, it's very clear cut. And it is essentially that you're going to be changing code without changing the behavior. That's ultimately the goal when we say refactoring. So if you have a class or you have a method, you're like, it's not organized in a way that I'm happy with for whatever reasons. That could be many things. It's not testable, it's not readable, it's whatever. But the end state is that the behavior does not change. Generally, that's the accepted way that people will talk about refactoring. But I like to mention that I I think in practice, the definition of refactoring extends beyond that. And people might say, well, then that's not the definition of refactoring. And I get it. But in practice, when we're working in teams with other developers and stuff, you will hear people say, I need to refactor this. And they generally mean something between a refactor and a local rewrite.
Mm.
And sometimes when it's pretty nasty, it's more than a local rewrite. It is a big rewrite, but we end up referring to these things as refactoring because the goal is still that you don't want to change the behavior, but like sometimes the behavior is going to change along the journey. So I like mentioning this because I see people will debate like, you should be able to refactor. That's why your tests won't break. And it's because if you're only testing the behavior, there's no way your test should break. But I just think in practice, that very strict definition is very hard to apply in many of the code bases that I've ever seen in my life. So, how do you feel about that as a working definition of refactoring?
I think it's the best way to explain what refactor is. And also, I think even when we are writing our own code, at some point we go back on what we did the day before or the week before, and we just say, oh, actually, I should rewrite or refactor this side because it's too messy, or because I was in a rush, and at some point you just get the job done, but you don't pay too much attention on what actually you are trying to achieve, if it makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So, for the most part, like I said, I want to make sure that the goal that we're talking about is generally not changing behavior. However, I I like adding the caveat in that depending on how big the refactor is, and in practice, a lot of the time there is some amount of behavior change. Just depends on the scope. If you're working on a team where you can scope down refactoring and stuff like that to be very small and truly just uh, not changing behavior, great. I just have not really seen that work in practice, and that's why when I talk about it, I like making sure that people understand, even if you go outside the, the lines of what refactoring is and it starts to become a bit more of a rewrite, like a lot of the same tools that we have apply in the same way. So that's my it's my little preamble. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, so give me one sec here. I'll get this Visual Studio window pulled up, and I want to double check on the stream that it looks okay, because it's gonna have our faces and Visual Studio. So, okay, I think it should be legible. It looks like our faces are at the bottom. In Riverside, they show it to the side, but on the
Mhm.
stream, it's at the bottom. So it's kind of funny. I like to just double check that stuff to make sure that nothing's going to get cut off or anything weird like that. But okay, so Rosario, when you joined the call, I said I put together a quick little program. It's very basic. We're going to hack it up and try to improve it. But the very basics of this program are going to be that there's some amount of business logic, and we can talk about extending this out, because there's going to be some different scenarios. Oh, Dan is on LinkedIn saying it looks good to him in terms of layout. Thanks, Dan. I appreciate that. So this will be some business logic. We could talk about scenarios where there's other people consuming some of our code. So, for example, you have a package that you published, or even within your own organization, how do we make sure we're not breaking other people when we're making refactoring changes? So, this is just one spot that's going to be consuming this API client that we're going to be talking about. So, this is the API client that we're probably going to spend the most time on doing some refactoring. um, this particular setup is generally not something I would totally recommend, but this is why it's a good opportunity to refactor it.
Exactly.
So there's a few things set up in here that I'm not a big fan of. And I'll walk through them, and then Rosario, maybe I'll kind of get you to see if there's like things you want to prioritize in terms of refactoring. But I
Mhm.
think there's a lot that we can touch on. So if you feel stuck, I think we can keep picking things apart. But super high level, all that this client does right now is it has a method on it to log in. There is no real endpoint. So this is obviously not, maybe it is a real website, but it's not mine. Um, so we're going to make a post request to this URL, and then we're going to have a username and password. And we have the username and password as user and pass just hard coded into here. And basically, if we get a successful response, we'll return true. That's all that this thing does right now. So if you were reading this, how would, like, what are the things that you might want to go change and adjust? And maybe we can go steer from there.
Yeah, first of all, I can see there are some new, which I think we should move out. Basically, this is because we just want to, first of all, we want to improve the testability of the code. So we want to make sure we are able to test every single part of the method or the class itself. So the first thing I will do in this case is just trying to inject in some way, in this case, the HTTP client. That would be the very first one. And then, as you said, we should parameterize the different part of the post itself. So it will
Cool.
be the URL, it will be all the information, maybe not passing as different separate strings. Maybe we could opt for an object. So in the
Sure.
future, if there is something else, all we have to do is adding the attribute to the class rather than changing again the signature of the method. Um, yeah, those are
Yeah.
the main things here, I guess.
Cool. No, that works for me. So, um, yeah, it's, and maybe before I start refactoring some of this, because Rosario, I know you had mentioned this to me, and I don't think we chatted about it ahead of time this call, but you had mentioned it to me in our messaging. So we want to make sure that we are writing tests on this stuff. But right now
Yeah,
there are
yeah.
no tests. And one of the reasons why there's no tests on this, and I want to touch on this for just a moment, is the way that this code is written would already be very difficult to test. And you might say, well, how is that hard to test, Nick? You just call login async. And then I would say, well, yeah, but we have to go make sure that this server is running. We have to make sure, like, you have now a system that is truly external to you that you're interacting with. And depending on what type of tests you're running and the context you're working in, that might not be a very good idea at all. In fact, in this particular case, it would be quite bad because this is just going to throw exceptions. Like, I have no control over that API. It's not going to be a good time. So right now there are no tests over this. But when we talk about refactoring, one of the things that you would probably want to do is get tests in place. So this code is not very unit testable currently. So some of the first suggestions you had about trying to get rid of newing things up can really help with making things testable. So I think that's a great spot to start. But the challenge of not having tests in place ahead of time means that I just want to acknowledge it, like we are at risk of breaking the behavior because we don't have a regression suite to
Of the
go
print,
against.
yeah.
So I'm not going to code that regression suite ahead of time here. Again, because how this is set up, it's just not going to be realistic. But if you are looking at this code and trying to compare it to something that you might have in your own code base at work, whatever it happens to be, you might have maybe not something so exaggerated like this where it's like an HTTP client. Maybe it's you're writing to the file system and stuff and you're like, okay, like I can at least maybe encapsulate some of that so I can do around my test like a cleanup, and you feel okay about that. So, and then there's some comments coming in on LinkedIn. Model passing instead of hard coded strings. So, yep, that'll be the second refactor we go to. So that's a great call out. And then someone else just said use HTTP client factory here. So that's exactly the first refactor that we're going to look at, is pulling this away and using the HTTP client factory. Before I do that, someone just asked, do you mind telling me more about regression tests? So yeah, just to kind of touch on this a little bit further, the goal when we're refactoring is that we want to make sure we're not breaking anything, right? That's I mean, you
That's the
could,
main
but
thing. Yeah, exactly.
you don't want to. You want to save yourself some time. So right now we have this class, but there are no tests at all over it. There's no unit tests that are testing with mocks and maybe touching some implementation details. There are no functional or any other, you give it a name, we don't have a test for it. There just aren't any. So there are no tests in code that would go exercise this method and then assert that some expected behavior is there. So generally, we would like to do that. And I would highly recommend that any code that you're going to refactor, you try to make sure, number one, do you have test coverage in place? Do you have the right test coverage? So I mentioned if you have mocks and stuff in your unit testing, again, some people are going to be triggered by this, but sometimes you will touch and change the implementation details when you're going through this. So tests like that are not very great for refactoring the method that you're working on. They can be great for telling you you're not affecting other things, um, but you want to probably have something that treats this like a black box, and you're doing some functional or integration tests with this. So, and then someone's mentioned again on LinkedIn adding interfaces and dependency injection. Yeah, so you're going to see very likely that that's the direction that we're headed in as we start to refactor this. But the goal with this is we're going to do it step by step, and then you can see some of the different questions we need to be asking. Because if we jump right to things like interfaces and dependency injection, which by the way, that would be something I would want to go do, especially if I owned all of this code. I would say, hell yeah, like let's go right to that. Um, but there are some considerations, and I think that's where we're going to see some interesting learning here. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that HTTP client. I'm not going to use a primary constructor because I think some people will be upset by it. Uh, so public our API client, I'm going to pass in an HTTP client factory. I don't want to do that, Copilot. It's good most of the time, but sometimes it's not quite what I want. And now that we have this passed in, what I'm going to do is make the client here. And this is essentially the very first step in refactoring. So I'm checking. There's Rob McCready, who's great on LinkedIn. We have some good chats. He's mentioned abstract API client base accepts HTTP client factory and holds that in a protected property. Define the iLogin API with login methods. Yeah, so you can see he's kind of going in the direction I think we're going to try to head. Um, Inject a mock of your login proxy. Yeah, so he's basically describing. Sorry, I'm kind of just reading that super fast, Rosario. I know you can't see the chat, so I apologize, but he's talking about pulling these pieces apart into smaller pieces and we can start to compose them. So that's an option. I think we are going to head in a direction that's very similar to that. But even though this looks like a very trivial refactor that we've just done, right? In theory, this should go make an HTTP client for us, the same behavior that we would have wanted. This may not work. And this, in fact, might not be a refactor that you could ever go land just like this. And Rosario, when you reached out to me, one of the things you mentioned was like constructor parameters. And what was the challenge that you were trying to navigate with constructor parameters in doing something as simple as this?
Yeah, sometimes, for example, you could have already a constructor in place. So, for example, in this case, we just added a new one because there wasn't. So that's an easy one. But let's put an example. When you have a class, you are going to uh, mm, update, and then, oh, there is already the constructor. So how I'm going to add any parameter, or how I'm going to inject anything in the constructor without destroying or creating any regression for the
Right.
people already there, basically. So that was an advanced, let's say, part of the refactoring itself. So what I'm going to do in this case, so for example, if the constructor is already there and there is already the high logger inside, the standard
Mhm.
parameter. And then, okay, in this case, we are adding the HTTP client factory, but that means that we are changing the existing constructor. So what are the options here? Should I have overload of the constructor? Should I add, for example, optional parameter to the constructor? Which are the pros and cons on each one of them, basically?
Right. And so great call out, right? So yes, we went ahead and we made sure that we didn't change the behavior of this class. I don't have tests that are proving that, but we will get to that. But now, and so Rosario, even in this example, though, we actually broke the calling code, right? So, yeah,
Yeah,
like technically we added a constructor, but the default constructor that's there just has no parameters. So we literally broke
exactly.
this code. But in this case, I own this code. I don't care. I'll go update the calling spot, right? I'll go pass in an HTTP client factory. Not a big deal. But let's assume that this was a class that was in a common project that other people are using, or it's in a NuGet package. So, oops, did I? Okay, yeah. So this is, I'm going to make this one Rosario's business logic. So if I owned this one in my code, and Rosario, you had your own business logic somewhere that had to go do some stuff and had to go use this client, I couldn't go publish this and ship it because if you updated, you would break,
Yeah,
right? If we have NuGet packages with versioning, this might be an acceptable thing where we're like, look, there is no other way around this. We must break this API. And then we would have to, maybe we do like a major revision or something. We have release notes where we're like, sorry, everyone, if you're going to update, expect this to happen. But this, I mean, it can be a conscious decision you make. And in many cases, there are going to be situations where you're like, it's going to be too nasty for us to try and make this work. But we do try as much as possible. But again, a simple refactor like this, depending on your context, you might say this is actually creating a ton of problems for other people. In all of the spots that we own, in this example, it's just one, very easy to go fix. We pass in the factory, but this is something we have to keep in mind. So I think it's important that you do talk about these types of things. Um, so just checking chat here again. Question: what .NET version are you using? This is .NET 8. I don't know if that's really going to matter for a lot of the stuff we're looking at, but that is what we're looking at here. Um, Someone said, I'm sure you want to suggest primary constructors. They tag someone, but I found them limiting in some cases. So this is an example. So I'll just touch on primary constructors for a second. The thing that I don't like about primary constructors right now is that we don't get the read only keyword that I'm highlighting. I think that otherwise, because I use dependency injection for everything, it basically saves me like those 3 lines where you see HTTP client factory get reduced into 1 line. And in the code I write personally, I am never touching things that are passed into the constructor. So it works for me in my own code because it would be a huge code smell if I saw myself reassigning something to HTTP client factory and it wasn't read only. But again, if you're working in code bases with other people, you have a team, you want to talk about what standards make sense for your team. Because if everyone agreed with me, great, primary constructors, awesome.
Yeah,
But if you have
makes
people
sense.
that don't align with that, it's going to be a bit of a headache, and you just want to make sure that you're setting people up for success. So, okay, we have this situation now where we said, hey, look, this might go break other people. So, one option we could consider is that we make this something like an optional parameter. So, we could go do this, and that would mean that we have to go do this to make it nullable, just to make the compiler warnings go away. Now we have one more compiler warning because technically this can break in some cases, right? If I scroll back up, we can see that this code up here is happy now. So I'm not going to break Rosario's usage of this, and I'm not going to break my own usage of it. So that's good news. But down here, this is still not right. So I think when I tried this earlier, Copilot did this. So this is something you could look at, and I think I need this here. So you could have an option like this where you're like, hey, look, we had this code released before. We don't like newing up HTTP clients the way that this was doing it, because this can lead to port exhaustion and a lot of other fun things, some resources being held around. So instead of doing that, we want to use the HTTP client factory. But people were already using the HTTP client. Maybe in their cases, it wasn't so bad. And if they truly want the fix, they're going to have to update their calling of this, but at least they have that option now. So this could be viable. It to me, it feels a little gross. But again, if you're trying not to break other people, this might be totally acceptable.
Yeah.
There isn't going to be a right or a wrong answer that's universal in all of these situations. This is one tool that we have to use. So, Rosario, any thoughts on this part so far? Anything else that you'd want to see change before we move on?
Yeah, this is what I will do in this case. As you said, it's not breaking any existent user. And we are also covering the testing because now is a bit more testable, the code. For example, we'll add the interface to the class itself. So that would help in mocking the tests as well.
Yeah, and I think the next part that when we were talking about this offline, right? One thing that is a bit of a headache still is that the client here, it's not this. Oops. Right. There is no interface for HTTP client unless someone knows something I don't, which if you do, please tell me. But we don't have this. So,
What
Rosario, you're
I'm going to
totally
do.
right that we will make one. So this is more testable than it was, but it still leaves a bit of a problem because if we want to go test this and we're going to use mocks to make sure that we're not truly going to go hit the internet, because let's say we want to write unit tests, not like an integration or functional test over this, we get this as an interface, but the resulting HTTP client that will do the communication, we can't simulate that. It's still going to go out to the internet. We got a question in the chat. Is it good practice to create optional constructor dependencies? I think that anything passed to the constructor should be essential for the operation of the object. Null to me feels like the dependency is just a method param and not constructor parameter. Any advice? Yeah, so it's a good question. This is why personally I'm not a huge fan of doing this. I almost never use optional parameters for a couple different reasons. One is like I actually like having. I would rather have more explicit constructors if it was something that was variable. I find optional parameters, they force the ordering because you have to put them at the end. Sometimes it's not aligned with how I like to think about things, but not the end of the world. To the question though, it seems like more of a method parameter. So you could go instead of passing in this in the constructor. I'm going to comment this out for just a moment. What we could do is we could go pass it in here, but this is going to change the signature that we're working with. But you could do this, and you could actually do something like this, where because we didn't explore this one ahead of time, but maybe you leave this old one in place, right? Where it's just doing this, and then we actually make a new method that's not going to take one like this, right? You could go do something like this, and then we have a different refactoring thing that we could go look at, right? Because now we have this duplicated code. We could go pull this out. So this is another viable option. But the question I ask is like, does the HTTP client factory make sense to be passed in on every method call? Or is that something that you truly do want to be part of the constructor? My opinion on this is that this dependency is something I would want as part of the constructor. However, using it this way does make the refactoring a little bit easier because now we don't have to worry about all of the breaking constructors and stuff like that. It's just if you want the new functionality, call the new method. So that is kind of nice.
Another
So
option
also good
is,
practice.
I'm not sure if I'm right, but I will say maybe the second method, you could make it private, and then from the existing method, you can just make a call to the new one, and then in the new one, you can set up whatever is needed. So in that case, you are not exposing the overloading. So they will still get the method as it was, but in the background, you are doing something completely different or something better in general.
Yep, that's exactly right. So you could do something like this where we pass in. So
Yeah.
I'm going to do await login, and then we would have to go basically. I don't even know if I can new up an HTTP client factory. There isn't a. I think I'd have to go make a wrapper. I don't know if we can access the built-in one, but the point here is that you would make a new, right? You'd have, sorry, autocomplete took over there. You could do this kind of thing and basically wrap that behind the scenes. So you could do that
Yeah.
for sure. There's a comment in the chat. Also, good practice to check is cancellation requested. We don't have that option really. Like we could do that here. Um, you could do something like this right at the start of your method if you want. That needs to be a semicolon, not a full colon. So you could do that. But basically, this is going to throw and cancel anyway. So you can save one line by doing it right at the start if you want. That's totally viable. And then I see Rob McCray. So Rob's comment here is something I'm in agreement with. It says injecting dependencies at the method level smells a little like impending SRP violation. And I agree. I think that it can work, and like truly this this functionally will operate. It just kind of goes against some of like the design principles that I want here. So he says the only reason to have a particular dependency be nullable and valid in that state is if you've got some methods on your class that don't use it. Feels like your class is responsible for too many things. So
Mhm.
yeah, I agree with that.
That's a
So
good point.
I'm going to go back to some of this code that we had. We're going to stick to the constructor. I'm calling out that I'm not a huge fan of the nullable part. Oh, I deleted too much. Oh no, that's okay. I'll put it back super quick. So come on, Copilot. Thank you. Don't have to do any work now. So here's where we've gotten to so far. We've called out that it's a little bit more testable, which is good. We still have this problem that if we want to go write tests, this thing is still an HTTP client, which is going to go connect to the internet. So not
So we are
something we
still
want.
unable. Yeah.
Now, something that I'm not familiar with because I haven't dug super deep into HTTP client, someone might be able to, if you're watching this live or you want to comment on it later, I think there might be a way that, when you create an HTTP client, so let's say that we are using a mock. for the factory and we pass in our own HTTP client, there might be a way that you can configure the options of the HTTP client itself to truly not go out to the internet. Like you might be able to put in some request handling stuff on the HTTP client itself. And that way we don't need to go create a wrapper around it with an interface to be able to mock it. I think that kind of functionality might exist with HTTP client, but I'm not totally familiar. So I just wanted to leave that as a thought
as an
exercise, but we
option.
can move on and keep kind of seeing what else we can do here. But you had mentioned this part was kind of
Yeah,
interesting, right? So parameterizing some of this stuff. Um, so this is something that if we keep going through this exercise of like how do we not break stuff, we start to get more and more problematic as we chip away at this, right? Because if we keep doing the same pattern, we'd say, okay, well, we need to have username and password have a default value, or else everyone has to know to pass them in. And this is probably something where I'm like, I think we have maybe a breaking API change, but how would that look, right? It basically starts to take shape like this, and you'd have these be set to their default values, which, by the way, anyone who's reading this code, if you're going, seems kind of weird that you'd be hard coding this stuff in the first place. Yeah, like you don't want your password hard coded. So this it's a contrived example.
it's
I
not a good
apologize.
practice. I agree.
So we don't want to do this in the first place, but imagine it's doing something else and you had hard coded values that's not your password. So if we have this kind of thing going on, you'd be able to do this. So we have these fields passed in, and then we can start to replace them here. One sec. This is going to be kind of nasty because the JSON. That's okay. So we need to go put user here.
Yeah.
It's not cut off the screen yet, so we're still good to go. Um, did I miss? I put an extra one in. There we go. So now we've parameterized it and we didn't break anything. Does this feel good though? Like I mean, it's kind of nasty, but truly we've refactored it to be parameterized at least. Um, if we did this in multiple steps though, so let's say that we released the other code, would we have broken anything if you wanted to pass in an HTTP client factory? I don't think so. Um, sorry, what I'm trying to say there is like if we had done this, say the last version is something we published, right? And it didn't have these things on it. So we published this, and now we're adding these in. Are we going to have a breaking API change? This is where your test would be really helpful to
Mhm.
see like, hey, did my test literally break? Like not in terms of it's not it's running and it's failing, but like the test doesn't even compile. You have code calling a code path that is now broken. Like that's a good indicator that you have a breaking API change. So um,
That's another main
this
point why you should have in principle the tests, because as soon as you refactor something, you can easily run the test and see step by
yeah,
step if you are introducing something wrong, basically.
totally. So let's maybe before I do this change, let's go jump over to some test code. I know this code is now not going to compile, not the point. And in fact, I don't even want to run the test quite yet. I just want to set it up to call or to make it look like it's calling the API. So that's my caveat here is like, we're not truly testing this thing yet. But if we had our API client, we made a new one. So this is the original way that we would have done it. And basically through all of our efforts of just adding in this, we now have proof that there's a test and you do, right? You have some tests that you're
Mhm.
running, but like we know that this code is going to compile because we can see it. Then we said, oh, like we need to do with the HTTP client factory. So now we have to go pass that in. Like I said, I don't even know if I can do that. Let me go. I don't know how we access the other one, but let's just say I don't like using fakes and stuff in the first place. This would generally be a mock. I'm just doing this super quick. So, because I forgot to go add mock as a as a NuGet package before starting this. We'll get to that though, I think. So we have this code now. So now we have these two code paths that at least compile, right? These aren't full tests, but they at least compile. Now we would want to go do the next part, which is, by the way, the names for these are going to be terrible, so I apologize. So we have this scenario where we want to be able to add
username and password.
Right? So we have these two things passed in. Obviously, this doesn't exist yet because I just commented it out. But if we go put it back in, interesting, right? It does work. Oh, it doesn't up here. It doesn't work. So this is a situation where we've just proven that if we go add these two things in like this, we actually went and broke the consuming code. So again, for folks watching this, like the goal when we're refactoring is to basically have the same behavior here. That's the goal, but you can't just ship this code if you're not thinking about the implications of where it's called. Like that is a huge, huge thing to consider. And it's often I see people start refactoring code. I mentioned this at the beginning of the stream, but it starts as a refactor and then it creeps into a local rewrite and then into a big rewrite. And then you keep having problems landing stuff because you have to keep going to make changes to all of the calling spots. And soon you've touched every file and you go, finally, my refactor's done. And it's a whole new product. So this is something you need to think about to scope down how far you can go. So how do we solve this? I think there is another solution here. It starts to get gross in my opinion though. So we can do this kind of thing and we can chain. By the way, I recommend chaining constructors together if you have to do this kind of thing. The reason I recommend doing this is that this type of thing is easy to mess up. Sorry, let me this one's not going to work. It's easy to start missing assignments of things if you have to copy paste them, because as this type of stuff continues to get copy pasted, inevitably you miss setting up something. And even when you're chaining constructors together, it gets pretty nasty pretty quick because you might be chaining to another constructor that works, but you're not passing in a piece of data that you have. So it can get pretty gross, but this is how I would at least recommend doing this one. And I think on this, we could probably do, can we do that? It still doesn't work. I wanted to see basically if we could just use a named parameter and then not have to pass in the defaults again, because that gets kind of nasty because like, I don't want to do this because you can see the defaults are in two spots. Can we use a constant? If it's constant, it might work.
Yeah.
So you could do this. Now we don't have it duplicated necessarily. Come on, Copilot. Thank you so much. That's one of the nice things for live streaming is if Copilot's doing its job, I just have to kind of think about things and it works. But did this work? Because this one's still not working up here. So what did I mess up? It's ambiguous now.
And doesn't know
Now
which
it's
one of the two.
ambiguous, right? So this is good evidence that this stuff is not as trivial as it seems on the surface, right? Just checking in the comments here, I suspect it's that implicit constructor calling your test method, saves keystrokes today, but gives migraines tomorrow. Here's the migraine right now. It's fine to inject primitive types as constructor arguments. Don't they make DI feel awkward? Yeah, so you're predicting the future of this live stream. We're going to get to hopefully see some dependency injection and why having primitives like this is not great. So in this current code, if we look at the calling locations, there is no dependency injection. And this felt difficult for me to write because I haven't written non-dependency injection code in like, Literally, the last time I did it was for my refactoring course. And even that was like, how do I type the code to not use dependency injection? Um, I'm feeling like the password and name should be method params instead. So, yes, but I want to give you a situation where that may not be the case. So I think that that is a good point. And sorry, Rosario, sometimes I'm reading the comments out and I'm not saying that I'm reading a comment. I just realized that.
That's
So
okay. No worries.
uh, if it seems like I'm having a conversation with no one, it's because there's a comment.
Yeah.
So, okay. But yes, I think that it makes total sense to be able to say that we want to have your username and password here. Now, just to highlight a situation where that's not necessarily the case is if you need to configure stuff with dependency injection once, you're never actually logging into other accounts and you want it to be passed in through a config, you can totally just pass it in through the constructor that has the config, and no one else that's calling has to know about the username and password. You basically do it via configuration. So someone just says, I need to log in to be authed. I don't know what the username and password is, but the very fact that I have a reference to this thing means that I can be authed. That's a viable option. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, because I would agree that generally, if you're writing something that logs in, username and password are pretty good parameters for that. So your context and your mileage will vary here. We still have this issue of these constructors colliding with each other. So what can we do to fix that? Jesse Bud, what is going on here? We're refactoring some stuff and we're trying to see if we can not break code as we're going along. So that's the goal. So,
Simple one.
yeah. What you could do in this case, I think, is now we have more constructors chained together, right? We've gone from having one constructor to one constructor with an optional parameter to now three constructors. It's pretty gross. And in fact, what you could do on top of here is start removing these, right? So we could do that. And actually, this one, like I said, for chaining stuff together, I actually want this one to go right to here, and it's not, it's bypassing it entirely. So you can start to do this type of thing. Actually, we can't. Sorry, I'm jumping around a lot, but I'm trying to see if we can clean this up for not having defaults and stuff passed around. But you can see that at this point up here, we need to be able to have an HTTP client factory. There isn't
Yeah.
another way that that's going to work. So I'm going to go undo some of this. Can I? Will this one work? Still won't. So no. So let me leave this. I don't like having two different ones. So these both call into this one down here. I don't really like that. The comment in the chat was simple solution is to start again. Yes.
That makes
Delete
sense.
it all, start again. You say it's gross, but the huge amount of .NET library has constructor overloads as default design choice. Yeah, they do. I'm not saying I agree with it in terms of how that's done, but it's a pattern for sure. I'm not a huge fan. Now, if you're starting to use things like dependency injection, sometimes the ergonomics of calling these constructors can change. You have to think about what is the caller going to think when they're typing new our API client. A lot of the time, if we're using dependency injection, you don't even think about that. You're just like, list my dependencies. Someone's going to pass them in. We're good to go. So there's a lot of things to consider. And that's why, like Rosario, when we were talking before this, it's like, the more tools and approaches you have at your disposal, the more options you have when you're in different situations, because you're going to find, different things have different answers for you. And then he goes, I'm on your side. Overload should be banned at all costs. Yeah. So unfortunately, we're approaching this with overloads so that we can stop other people from being broken. And I want to reiterate that because again, we could jump to interfaces and dependency injection as one big step. We could do that. But depending on your code base and who's consuming your interfaces or your classes, you just might not have that luxury. So at this point, if we go back to where the tests are, you know, these are not actual tests for anyone that's just joined. These are just proving that we can call the constructors that we're interested in. So far, this works. But we were talking about this part being pretty nasty with two strings passed in here, right? Um, and I already broke, this is why you need tests. I already broke this functionality. When I was messing around, I removed these. So that's what we should have had. So there we go. Okay. We talked about this though, where you're having a username and password, right? Let's pretend. Let's pretend for a moment. The first time we made this code change, I know this is going to make some people cringe. It's hard for me to write this, but let's assume that someone writing this API originally decided, I want to have password and username. Now, a refactoring that you can do, this is a common thing, is to reorder your parameters, right? Someone might have said, hey, look, I don't know why you did this in the first place. I'm sure there was a good reason. I can't think of a good one, but I'm sure there was a good one. I think that we should refactor this to be more usable for the callers. It should be username then password because that's what people expect. I think that's a fair thing to say. People want username then password. So again, this code here is going to be wrong, right? We would want to go, this is what it would have looked like, your password, then your username. Okay, so if we wanted to go change the order of these things, we run into a very big problem when we think about the code that already exists that we do not own. And even for the code that we own, we have to know all of the spots to go touch. So I think in Visual Studio, we might be able to change the signature. You should be able to just do, oh, I just realized it's sharing the window, but it's not showing the window for the pop-up. So you guys can't see that I'm going through a refactoring menu in Visual Studio. So that's not very helpful. Let me back up and explain what I'm doing. So I'm going to watch the stream and make sure that if there's no visual popping up, I can explain what's there. So you can't see my context menu, which sucks. So I'm right clicking on our API client. At the very top of the menu, quick actions and refactorings. There's an option there that says change signature. So I'm clicking on that and it puts up a dialog box that has all of your parameters in it. So you could use this dialog and switch your username and password around, which I've done. By the way, this was already wrong.
Password, yeah.
Forget that. But it basically just went through and changed the order for us. And if I go look at the calling spots, it also changed the calling spots. This is very powerful if you have all of the code that consumes your API in the same solution.
Yeah.
Because Rosario, if this code that we had over here that says Rosario's business logic, if this was in your own solution on your machine doing some stuff that's unrelated to me, I just
Won't
went and
work
did this
anymore.
refactor. Yeah, and I'm like, hey, look, it works. It's perfect. It compiles on my machine. Now your stuff will be completely broken if you update to this. So this would be a breaking API change. Okay, so what can we do to try and help make that better? Well, one option is to try and essentially pull these into something like a record that we can pass along. We could use strongly typed IDs. We could do a combination of the two things, sorry. Password would not be a strongly typed ID, but you could make username a strongly typed ID. And that way it's not going to fix that things will break, but it will make it very obvious. It will be a compilation error instead of the username and password being flipped, and then
Try
you
to
have a
understand.
runtime error. So that could be something we look at. So Rob McCready saying Resharper is great when all your consumers of your methods and classes are in the same solution. Yep. If you're extending the public API on a library package, you have to be sensitive to the installed user base out in the wild. Absolutely. And this, and admittedly, think in my course I tried to touch on this, but maybe honestly, maybe not enough attention to it because I think so often we're thinking about refactoring, don't change the behavior, very important. But you need to think about all of the spots that are calling your code, and especially for people that are working in smaller code bases or your own projects, it's very easy to be just hyper focused on my own usability. So at this point, if we wanted to go pull this stuff into a record, it depends. Did we already ship this code? Right? Are we going to have yet another thing that we want to go extend onto here? I might take this opportunity to say, let's say that we didn't ship this because I think the exercise is going to become more and more challenging to move forward if we have to keep coming up with APIs. So let's say that we were talking about shipping this, but we didn't go ahead and do it. We said, that's not good enough. We should try to package these things up. So what you might do is something like a record type,
Mhm.
login info. I'm terrible with names, but um, there we go. Copilot knows what I want. We could go ahead and do something like a login info, and we could pass that in. I scroll too far. So we have that. And username and password. Do we want to do that in here? Maybe, again, to clean this up, I would do. I don't think there's a right or wrong thing here. Maybe I want to store the whole login info inside the class. That way, if I add more stuff later, I don't have to go,
Exactly.
trim
Yeah,
out the
makes
other
sense.
fields and stuff. Again, not a right or wrong thing, just a choice for right now. That way here, we put this in. This is starting to go off the screen a little bit, so let me just go ahead and clean this up a tiny bit. Some people will say that's not making it clean. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to do this to make it more readable. There we go. That's lovely, isn't it? Okay. So now we have this passed in, but this is all busted and weird now. So we need to go make sure that we're assigning this login info. So this one, pretty simple. I think we're okay here. This one and this one are going to be a little bit odd. So if we need to go from this constructor that only takes the client factory, we
Mhm.
need to be able to call into this one. So we should be able to do something like, oh, I kept the constants. That's good. You could do this. Someone might say, well, now you're going to be allocating a new login info every time. So we can go one step further.
Yeah.
We'll make a default login. Why doesn't it like that? Oh,
The
needs a
static.
type.
Yeah.
There we go. I'll get rid of that, pull this down just to kind of make it a little bit more readable. I'm trying to be conscious of how far on the screen it's going on the stream. So now we have this default login, so we can put that here. And that means we can go here. My goodness. Sometimes I forget when you have a microphone in front of your face and you're trying to type stuff, like you have it in your peripheral. It's a little weird. I'm just checking the chat to make sure. There's probably some comments coming in here. Resharper is great. Okay, we read that one. Minor, some version update. When you're adding optional new features, you might need to add some overloads. Yep. Getting rid of those overloads can happen on the next major package version release. Yeah. And you can use that as an opportunity to be able to signal to consumers like, hey, we did this thing. You got this much time to figure out how to stop using it if you want to continue to update. So Rob also went on to mention sometimes we have to incur technical debt, absolutely, but these cases are perfect examples. We're taking it on as an investment where we have a concrete plan to pay that tech debt back with the future version, right? And I think that's totally fair. You might even plan for that and say that's what we're going to do, and then it turns out that like you never do it and you're able to work in the code base still and it's not really a problem, but at least you planned for it and had this thought process of here's the direction we'll go. If your priorities and stuff change later and people are still able to work in the code base and it's not a nightmare, great. Like you basically just avoided doing work,
Mhm.
and that might be totally viable. What else is going on here? That's a classic Microsoft bait and switch. Okay, yeah, let's settle down with the Microsoft jokes. I gotta go to work soon. Remember that at Microsoft. Cool. Okay, so we have this API kind of set up for us. Again, if we go back to our code here, sorry, we said that we weren't shipping this part, right? We said this new one, we would have something like this. And we can prove now that we have a scenario where this will exist. We would write tests on it, but we have coverage over calling this code to at least make sure that at compile time, it's not going to blow up for us. So, pretty good option to parameterize stuff. Again, just for if people are joining the stream and stuff, yeah, login info probably a good fit as method parameters here. I mentioned earlier there are options where you may not want to do that because you don't need all of your callers to know the credentials or have access to them. You're just giving people who have access to this thing authority. Okay. So now, Rosario, what are your thoughts? Do you have other things that you would like to see on this? Are we ready for some tests or anything else you want to see us kind of pull apart on this before we move on?
I think we said for the URL of the API, right? We were thinking to parameterize as well.
Yeah, we can absolutely do that. So
And I was also
this is a
thinking maybe we could add the interface to the class itself.
yeah, so the HTTP client part,
Yeah,
having that one wrapped have as a
yeah,
proxy. Yeah,
exactly. Like a proxy.
let's do
Yeah,
the
exactly.
URL one. Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's do the URL one. Let's take a different approach because we've been jamming stuff through the constructor. Um again, we could have done that with the login info. There's no right or wrong thing here. It's just an example to walk through stuff. But let's pretend that this one, we're like, this one has to be configurable on on the on the method name or on the sorry, the method signature itself.
Mhm.
Is this a good choice? Like probably not. I probably should have done it the other way, but it doesn't matter. It's just a working exercise. So if we wanted to, the goal here is we're saying uh, basically whatever API you're trying to hit, that URL needs to come into play here. And just to so I don't lose that, like that's what we're saying. But if we go back up, it's going to break code. We can't just we own all of the calling sites, and that's a sufficient amount of work for us that we're happy to go change. But in the example we've been going through so far, I can't make that assumption. How do we live with this? We could use another optional parameter like this, but one of the reasons I don't like optional parameters is now I have to do this. Oops, I need an N on token. So you don't have the luxury, as soon as you put an optional parameter and anything else after has to be optional as well. Um, some people might say, well, cancellation token, I don't care. Like, let it be optional because most people on their async APIs do. I personally like enforcing it in any API that I write that's asynchronous. I force it. I don't care if it's more ergonomic to not have it. Like, I want you to be thinking about passing in your cancellation token. So the point here, though, is not cancellation token specific. It's if you're trying to do this with your API and you want it to be default, you're basically stuck putting it on the end or making everything else before it have a default value, which can be
Mhm.
pretty nasty. I'm not a huge fan of doing a default here. This is where I might take a different approach. Again, it's not right or wrong. These are all things that you have to weigh out for how you want your code to exist. Let me go ahead and put this back for a moment. What I would probably do from here is just have another overload. Like I would want to hide some of this. We kind of talked about this earlier for having an overload, and then in the body of the method, we're doing a little bit of extra stuff to kind of hide that from the caller. So I might go ahead and do something like this, where I force this to happen. And then up here, this one does not have it. And I would get rid of that. And sorry, I'm jumping around a lot here. But we get rid of all this stuff in here, and we have this. We could pull this into a constant as well, and then we would go call this method down here.
Yeah,
So
makes
this is
sense.
something where we can get more control over the signature by not having defaults and having to change the ordering or that kind of weird stuff. So again, just an option. No Copilot, not quite what I want. That's what I want. Thank you. It'll get it at some point. So we do get this kind of option. Uh, I just realized there was a question mark on that guy. There should not be. I saw a compiler warning. We got to watch for those. But now we have, if we scroll back up, these ones are not broken. If I jump into the calling code, we can see that it's doing what it used to do, right? We're using
Mhm.
that default. I would maybe let's go. Is there a good refactoring option for this? You can't see it because you can't see the context menu, but I right clicked on it. One of the refactoring suggestions was introduce constant. And then I can do a local or a constant at the class level. So I'm going to go do that, pull it up here. There we go.
Yeah.
So a nice constant pulled up. This is, that this is kind of an opinion. Some people may want to say, hey, I want my constants to be local scoped. It's only used in the one spot to find it in the spot. Um, these things are probably configurable anyway. Reality is like these were probably not good things to hard code in the first place. But you may have code where you started off that way and you want to keep building on top of it. I think that's another important note to make is there's so much stuff that you will see in posts on LinkedIn, in blog articles, and YouTube videos. And it's basically here is perfect code. And here is how we work with perfect code to do more perfect things. And the problem is that as soon as you start working, you will never see perfect code ever.
Yeah,
So you
that's
have to
true.
be prepared to navigate these things. And so Rosario, would you say that's fair from your experience though? That like, you know,
I
yeah,
can
okay.
guarantee. Sometimes I had look at some really bad code, much worse than the one I wrote. So you, I perfectly
Yep.
agree with you.
Right. And it's funny because, when we say the code's bad, like I've written code, sorry, I read code and been like, man, this is bad. And then I realized I wrote it. But the point is like it's not that when we say it's bad code, like we always believe or we should believe that whoever wrote that code at some point in time was doing it with all of the information they had at hand, doing their best job with what they knew, right? It's not like someone purposely was like, I'm going to write this really crappy code and upset someone 2 months from now or 2 years from now. Hopefully, no one does that. But unfortunately, as code bases evolve and patterns evolve and people start doing, better practices, there is going to be like these landmines we come across where we're like, oh crap, like now we got to deal with this. So it's just the nature of reality. I'm gonna check the comments in the chat before moving along here. Um, in defense of Microsoft, .NET and C Sharp is one of the best languages ever created, ever, and it isn't their fault. We, including me, make poor design choices. Yeah, that's a really interesting comment. I mean, it's you can't control how everyone uses stuff. I think there's probably some things that when designing the language, they can keep what's the phrase? It's like the pit of success. Like you can keep pushing people into the pit of success, but it's really difficult with such a generalized language. You can do so many things with C sharp. It's really hard to force people into this pit of success when you're saying, here's 100 ways you could do it, and we're giving you flexibility. So that's an interesting one. Um, the CLR's artwork, absolutely. Rob is saying to Jesse, I blame the product owner and scrum master for my bad design decisions. Yep. You're rushing me. Yeah. Cool. Wait, if you're not, yeah. So Jesse was saying about the cancellation token. If you're not consuming the cancellation token, you have a big issue. Yeah, that's a great point. Um, my toxic trait is not working harder to form the cancellation token habit. Yeah, absolutely. So, like I was saying, the way that I got around that, because I had about 2 years ago, I guess it's been just over a year now when I canceled it. I had a side project going on as a fitness and nutrition platform that I was building. And one of the things that I realized was that I had written all of my web APIs and nothing was passing in a cancellation token. And I said, okay, and I own the code. I spent a lot of time on it. So broke some of my refactoring practices. I basically started saying in my bottom-most layers of my whole application, cancellation token required. Start dropping that in, and then it's just compilation errors, 300 compilation errors, and chip away. Like force myself. You need to pass in the cancellation token. So
It's a really good
it's
practice anyway. Yeah.
yeah, it's one of those things. It's easy to kind of say like, I'm not canceling it, just like go away, like let me keep coding. It's an extra parameter I have to think about. But yeah, we need them, so please use them. Okay, so we have the API URL passed in as a parameter now. What we probably should do is go back to here. Again, I'm not going to test these, but we could do a login async. Oh, I made it void. Sure, whatever. This is not what you want to do. You want this to be async. I'm just trying to get the API calls in here, right? So we'd have this type of thing. And then maybe on this one, we said we want to do it the other way. Also not a URL, but that's okay, right? So we have coverage over these. And if we ever want to go change, we can see, hey, look, the API is actually broken. So again, the point of your test is to exercise the code, which I'm literally not doing here. I'm not asserting anything. These are terrible, terrible tests. I'm just trying to demonstrate that we have some call sites where we have the APIs we want to call. So very minimum type of thing here. Okay, Rosario, the other thing you mentioned was this part here with the HTTP client. Um, yeah, and Jesse and Rob are talking about cancellation tokens here. Rob says, I confess to a poor understanding of the cancellation token concept. I know it's important, but I'm not 100% sure why. Any web resources I could look at? I don't know if there's a good, like off the top of my head, a good resource. Jesse kind of chimed in to say, it's not, am I canceling? It's, am I being canceled? And I think that's the frame of mind you want to have. You're in a method, and if you're asynchronous, what you want to be thinking about is like, someone on the outside may abruptly need to stop what I'm doing because they're trying to get resources back or trying to shut down, whatever it is. I need to stop. And you're off running off into outer space doing whatever calculation or IO operation you might happen to be doing. The whole point is that when we have asynchronous code with the ability to cancel, is that we can take something that might be long running. Long running here is subjective. I'm talking anything more than like, microseconds kind of thing. If you're taking time to do anything, someone on the outside should be able to say, stop everything you're doing right now. And where you put your cancellation token checks will change that. So I think that's probably how I would explain that. But looks like Jesse's doing a good job in the chat trying to elaborate on that. So thank you, Jesse. I appreciate that. Okay, we got this HTTP client. Let's go make this thing better. Like I said earlier, I think there are ways that we could avoid everything we're about to go do here with this proxy class and interface. I think that you can configure this thing to not go to the internet. But the pattern that I'm going to show here is about making things more testable with proxy classes and an interface. And if you're like, hey, Nick, like, yeah, you can avoid this with the HTTP client, don't worry about it, cool. What about for using static file classes in the file system? There's so many situations where when you new up something, what you're basically acknowledging is that if you want to go write a test over this, you must be using the implementation that's provided right here. Some people might say, good, I want to test the real thing. And I say, that's great until you don't have control over it for a scenario you want to exercise.
And that is no longer a unit test, right? That will be a kind of integration test at that point.
100%. And what I think is important to acknowledge about that statement is that someone might say, yeah, but I want to write those types of tests. And I think that's a fair statement. But going back to Rosario, what we were talking about earlier was this idea that if you have options, if you have options, then you can make decisions about which option you want to use. So instead of saying, I just want integration tests anyway, like screw the interfaces, forget the mocks, I would just say, what if you got in the habit of doing the other thing so it didn't feel like more work to you? And then if you want the luxury of a unit test or an integration test, you can literally write both. You can do anything you want because
Mhm.
you've structured the code in that way. Code like this does not lend itself well to being unit tested because you're using real things that you can't control. I put out some videos about this the other day talking about almost this exact thing. I don't control the HTTP client. And if you wanted to write tests that prove that you have retry logic in place, you can't. You can't because you don't control what the HTTP client is giving back. Now, again, I think this class actually has some things you can hook into. It's beside the point. But when you don't control the dependency, you can't simulate different behaviors. So that's just
Right.
where I'm
Could be
going with that.
also a database connection, or could be, as you were saying, I'm going to write on a file. So what happens if I can't? So in
Right.
some way, when I'm writing unit test, I need to be 100% sure that I can test almost everything.
Yeah. And do you need to test everything? Probably not. But having the again, it goes back to having options. If you were in a situation where you said it would be critical for me to know if this behavior exists, you would need to be able, like, so I'm writing a file and I need to be able to retry, as an example. Okay, how would you go about simulating? I need to have a file that is open with some other process, like something's holding the handle. I need to try writing to it. Once I've tried and it fails, make sure that I catch my exception. Now release the handle. Now try to write again. Like, if you're not mocking things out, your ability to test becomes completely, like, overwhelmingly challenging depending on your situation. So
Mhm.
um, I'm just trying to read more. Okay, people are still talking about async stuff, so that's cool. Okay, we're going to go ahead and wrap this thing in a proxy class. So how I would generally do this type of thing is I would make a sealed class, and this one is going to be really simple because HTTP client does a bunch of stuff. We're only using one thing. I'm only going to do this one thing, and I'm going to basically map the API call so that we're not doing anything fancy. It's going to be a direct drop in.
Mhm.
So how that would look is I would go right to here, which looks terrible. Where's the line? Too many comments. Holy. I would basically take this whole thing out, go back to here. I would make a wrapper, and this thing would have a private read-only HTTP client, generate a constructor. Thank you very much. So let's do this. This is just going to be a pass-through. So in fact, thank you, Copilot. Literally, I'm not doing anything except proxying the method call to the wrapped class. Then from there, you can't see the context menu. I'm Alt Enter gives us the refactor menu. Extract interface is what I'm picking. Again, you can't see it. I'm making an iHTTP client. I'm going to add it to the current file. I don't know why it jumps us to the top like that, but you can see it added this interface right here. So now we have this,
That makes the class perfectly testable. Yeah.
right? So we have that. Now, what's going to be tricky though, I just realized it's not a solution for us yet, and I'm going to explain why in just a moment. This isn't. I knew this was going to happen as an oversight from doing a little bit of prep. I was like, we're going to run into something. Could you please increase font size? I can. Let me know if that helps. There's only so much real estate on the screen though. Um, okay, so I'm going to explain why this looks like it's going to work, but it still doesn't work for us. Um, so we're saying now we have the interface, but what we would be doing is this. The problem is that we don't control, like, this is still newing up a class. We basically need something that can give us back an iHTTP client. So I didn't think this one through, but it's going to make our refactoring even more challenging because this part here is still the problem. And it's still the problem because we have this essentially, right? So from here, like I have an interface, that's great, but I can't I can't mock this one out because it's being created here. So I have to go one step further. And it would mean that this HTTP client factory that creates a client, you can't see my tooltip, I realize. So when I'm hovering over stuff, it's not helping. But the create client call, because this returns an HTTP client, not the interface, we kind of need to get one level before this to say, no one's giving us back a real class. They need to give us an interface for us to work with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
How are we going to solve this? I'm not sure yet, but I think we have to have something else. And I'm going to be terrible with names. It's essentially the same idea, though. So we need to be able to do this. Might be a breaking API change, though, for what it's worth. I don't know quite yet. So let's see. I can't use this name because this already exists. So we could do something like this just to give it a different name. And the difference is that I want to give it an interface on the return type. One of the tricky things, it's not very obvious, is that create client is a extension method. And it uses this default name. So what we're actually seeing when we call create client is actually this. So let's see. Technically, what I would want to do is have this, or you do an extension method the same way they did, but we're calling this, not this one everywhere else. Now, what I would want to do, again, I'm kind of flying by the seat of my pants right now. I have no idea if this is going to work or not, so I apologize. But I want to be able to do a proxy factory HTTP, sorry, I proxy, this one. I put a semicolon. There we go. So we would go implement this thing, which basically, sorry for jumping around. I zoomed in, so it's hard for me to see what's going on now. The code here, actually, let me call all of this. You would basically do, how's this going to work? This one just calls the other one. Because can we get HTTP client? I want to get the default options. Oh, I guess it's there. Default name is just an empty string. So this one's just a pass through to the other method. And then inside here, we have to go do this work.
Yeah.
And then we need to pass that in. So almost, I don't want that to be nullable. And the way that would all work, we're not going to be doing the nullable thing. Like if someone's making this, they're making the real thing. So we have this proxy factory now, and what we would want to do, good thing we have those tests in place because we're about to break some code. I have to zoom out a little bit. I'm sorry because I can't I can't navigate my own code when it's that far zoomed in. We have to go change this stuff here. So depending on when we realize we're about to have this problem, right? This could be a real scary refactor because we don't want this anymore. Even though we added it in, we need this proxy one. So that means up here and here. And I think we have it passed in all the places, which means we don't do that. I'm doing this and trying to figure out how bad this is going to be in just a moment. I made it nullable. So we could still make it nullable, perhaps. if we make, okay, so here's what I'm thinking. If you truly wanted to still support the older calls and not break the API, we have to start forking the code a little bit, and it's a little bit gross. So you start to introduce tech, like you're consciously introducing tech debt to say we want to support both ways, where someone can basically new up an HTTP client still because they never had this proxy thing in the first place. So if you need that, we still have to navigate it the right way.
Mhm.
Um, Otherwise, we just kind of skip it. So I want to see if we can. It's going to look gross, but maybe we can support both and just see what's up. It will mean that the legacy, this is important to call out, the legacy calls that do not pass in the proxy one, they will still not be unit testable because they would still be using a real HTTP client. Okay, so how is this going to work? Well, I really need to think this through for a second. So it's going to come down to posting. And what we might be able to do is I'm trying to figure out how we can reuse this code. So this is going to get messy for a second. Can I jump in here and recommend you use monads? How would you, Jesse, if you want to write in the chat how you might expect to see that, that would be cool. But I have I think what you're about to say is the direction I'm going, but I might not have referred to it as the same way. So the point is that this code right here, regardless of the parameters and stuff, I need this signature. And that's this signature here. So I could do something like, I'm going to get rid of this, sorry. What's the return type? It's a task. So we could basically have a method, or I might do a func here. How's this going to work? This is the wrong way to do this. Sorry. I need to have, I want to assign a variable that is a function pointer to one of these two options. So either it will point to a real HTTP client's post method, or it will point to the other one. But this syntax is making me lose my mind here. So I need to assign it to, one sec. That's making me super confused. There's too much going on here. Jesse Budges wrote out monads again. So, okay, let me see. I want to write the code first that's going to create our clients in the two different ways. One is a real client and the other one is not. I think once we have that in place, we can start to see how this will shape up a little bit better. So we don't need the wrapper. In one case, we will be using our client factory to create a client, just like this. And the other scenario is if our HTTP client is null. So if this was null, right, we can't use it. So we would have to go make a new HTTP client. So you have these two things, but we only want one in one case and the other in the other, but they both have this method on them. So I don't know why this syntax is so confusing for me up here right now. Oh, that's because with a func, we have to pass in all this stuff over on the other side. So that's why. String HTTP content, which is also nullable, and cancellation token as well. So we have this method, right? And we could basically go say, if, let me just, I'm going to write as an if statement that we can turn it into a ternary operator after. As far as I know, you must create concrete implementation of HTTP context, or you have to use third-party. I don't know if I'm going to have to create an HTTP context yet. We'll see. I have a feeling I'm not going to do that because I think I can bypass all of that. but it's only going to be in the scenario where we are using our proxy class, not for the normal HTTP client. So Mo, I think we can avoid that challenge in particular, but we'll see in just a second. So if this HTTP client, oh, Copilot actually had it right there. No, Copilot. If, there we go. Look at that. So this is really what's happening here, right? So we can reduce this even further. I'm just going to combine this because I want to see if we can make it a ternary operator.
Mm-hmm.
Aha. Okay. So if it's not null, I'm trying to just put this all onto the screen. Sorry. Now, there we go.
Oh.
So this code is wild. But the goal here is that we're trying to still support, if you don't have one of these proxy things, you can still call it. Now, again, like I was saying, depending along the life cycle of when we introduce this, if we already had that other HTTP client factory, we would have yet another overload we'd want to do. I would honestly recommend that, like, this is another indicator. If you put interfaces on things, you can swap out the implementation entirely. For folks that don't know what I mean by that, for this API client, if you had a spot that was like a factory that could return an interface to an API client, a lot of these problems could go away because you could just make a whole new implementation of an API client and not try to maintain all of these things. You'd say, cool, that one's released. It's out there. It's in the wild. People are using it. We don't love it, but we'll go make a new one and it meets the same API spec or a version 2 of the API, and then people can make that one. But that means that, again, if we go back here, it's not going to be happy, right? What did I call it? Proxy. And what doesn't it like? Oh, so this is where we would use mocks. So maybe this is a good opportunity to talk about mocking things. So let's assume that we had not released the iHTTP client one and we went right to our proxy one
Mm-hmm.
because we caught ahead of time. We said, hey, look, we know that we're going to have to go mock this stuff out. Is this all? Rob is saying, is this all to mock HTTP client? I smell carrots. Yeah, this is going to be a rabbit hole for sure. Um, this is why I was saying I think that HTTP client, you can literally set some things on it that will not go do actual web requests, I think. But also, I would just recommend people design things with interfaces so that I don't have to do this kind of stuff. Please, .NET team, use more interfaces. We finally got time provider. Like, thank you. So that you're not trying to simulate time with ridiculous things. Okay, let's go ahead and I'm going to add mock. This is my preferred mocking framework. Some people hate it because there was some stuff that came out the other, whatever, 2 years ago now, where they were like scanning repositories and stuff. I don't know. I'm not in it for the drama. I'm in it to mock stuff. So let me go ahead and I'm going to private read only mock repository. Sure. I make mocks with strict mocks. So this would be mock behavior strict up here. And then from there, and sometimes depending on what my test class looks like, I will have a constructor that goes ahead and makes a lot of the dependencies ahead of time. But because in this case, we're actually looking at different constructor calls, I don't want to go make our system under test one time in the constructor of the test file. And by the way, with XUnit, that constructor runs before each test call. So it looks like it's in one spot, and it is, but it's called every time before every test. I don't want to do that here because we actually need the different constructors to be called. So I'm going to create, sorry, I don't need to create, there it is. I proxy, there we go. Yeah, so Rob saying, I looked at mocking HTTP client at the start. Apparently, you need to instead mock HTTP response handler and inject that into the HTTP client when you instantiate it. So yeah, that's. I was saying I think there's a way to do it. I thought it was setting things, but yeah, it's the response handler that you can mock. So that's cool. We just took a completely different approach. I think this will still work, but I think the other way would have allowed us to not go do this second jump to a proxy factory at least. So that's nice. So thank you, Rob, for shouting that out. I figured there was something weird going on there, but I didn't know what it was. So proxy object, right? We'd get that. Oops. Yeah, the object. So now we have those two things passed, or on these two tests, we have that dependency passed in, and we could start mocking things out. Um, So I'm just doing a time check. I do have to wrap up in about 15 minutes. So Rosario, from your perspective, do you want to go through writing the tests for these, or was there another aspect if we jump back here that you wanted to see kind of touched on?
I think we covered all the points I was that were pending from the course I did. I think we are in a really good shape now. Thank you very much for this.
Cool. Okay. So, folks, I'm probably not going to rub saying gross about the HTTP client stuff. Yeah. I'm not going to go through writing all the tests for these things, but what I want you to think about, and I'm just going to change up this one, let's say, so that it's not super gross because this is driving me nuts. I don't want to see this on my screen with the weight. You do something like this. And what you need to think about is what's going to be called and touched inside of your method, right? So if we go into login async, we know that we've created this thing with an HTTP client factory. So it would mean that if we go to run this test in particular, this thing should blow up right now. And it will blow up because nothing is calling or nothing is set up the mock. So just to prove it, oh, come on, Visual Studio. There we go. Test fails. And it should say invocation fail with mock behavior strict. All invocations must have the mock, like a core setting set up. So there's no corresponding setup. Sorry. There's no create client setup on here. So it's telling us it's doing this. We need to go create one of those things. So we would go set up that mock to then go return a mock IHTTP client. And then from there, what you could do is you could prove to yourself that you're going to call post async with the right API URL that you're expecting, because that's
Mhm.
important, because you can check that. And if you don't check it, someone could pass in the wrong thing. Maybe your default one's wrong. So you can check that your default's being passed in. You can check your payload. These are implementation details, and people would say, don't ever do this. I don't know why, if like you would completely skip out on a test like this if you thought it was going to be valuable, because you don't own the endpoint to test against. Now, with what Rob was saying, if we were setting up the HTTP client with the other handler piece that we could mock out, we might be able to avoid some of these things, and that's okay. But the point is that how I would go approach unit testing this is essentially setting up mocks and going through that. So we don't have to go through that exercise, because I think hopefully the
It's clear
point
to
you
everyone.
can
Yeah.
see we're set up to do it at least, right? So I will wrap up the code part there. So I'll stop sharing. Um, but yeah, how did you find going through that exercise? Was that helpful?
I think it was great. We started from a really simple at the beginning method, and then we went through, and I really enjoyed the fact that we were all together and trying to find the right solution rather than, just watching you coding.
Sure.
That's the real meaning of having a live stream rather than just watching a YouTube video, I guess.
Right.
Thank you very much for
Yeah,
this.
of course. Yeah. And thank you for, again, for reaching out about this, because I think one of the things that I feel like is missing when people talk about refactoring is there's so much focus on the implementation, or the behavior. Don't change the behavior. But there's a lot of points missing about who's consuming this thing, because when you go to refactor, you can refactor and not change the behavior, but all the call sites, like you need to be thinking about that too. So I think it's just an overlooked thing for sure. So
Another
thanks so
good point
much.
you Another good point you mentioned it in your course is the fact that sometimes you are while you're refactoring, you are also renaming variables, and that could cause breaking change to whatever is reverse engineering your code. So yeah, I think it's a combination of things you need to care about, and not, as you say, not just looking at the refactor itself, basically.
Right. Yeah, the renaming one, I'll just mention this briefly. I always like mentioning this when people are like, the easiest refactor is renaming, not even a method, because sure, that could change.
I was laughing this because this is what I usually do. I never thought about this. I just said, "Oh yeah, that's true."
So it's not great practice when you have things that are saying like using reflection to go look at fields and things like that. But there is certainly code that does this, and for good reason too. Like it absolutely exists, especially when you're talking about mapping objects and serialization. It's not uncommon, and people will say the easiest refactor, and maybe other people have different opinions, but the easiest refactor is you can rename a variable, right? How could you possibly break anything? And the way that you break something is when you have something using reflection or something else that's expecting that name, you've just broken that expected behavior. Seems weird because you probably don't want to be writing code that depends on this stuff, but your context is incredibly important when you're doing this kind of thing. So you need to be aware of all this stuff. So hopefully you don't have situations where you're renaming stuff and it's breaking all your code, but it's possible.
Could happen.
It could happen. So again, thanks, Rosario. I do
Thank you very
appreciate you
much,
reaching
Nick.
out.
Thank you,
This
everyone.
was really fun. So thank you. Okay,
Thank
take
you.
care, folks, and we will see you next time.